So for those of you who've done these CGI sessions with me before, you know that I take the topic at hand somewhat liberally. And I think with talents like these here, we're going to discuss emerging markets. But I think that it's been clear from the last few weeks that the state of the emerged markets plays a very large role in the health of the emerging markets. If you just watch the news of the Fed tapering or not tapering, sending emerging market stock markets high and low. So with that as my excuse, I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about some of the big issues that are swirling around right now, and then we will move on to talk about emerging markets. Lloyd, let me start by asking you. You see what's going on in Washington right now, and I'm wondering, what do you think the economic impact of what is happening in the Senate, the position of the House Republicans is on markets and people's understanding of the American economy?
Well, I say the confrontation and the way that confrontation is being carried out is having a very bad impact on the markets, and it's totally foreseeable. Wherever you stand on the content, on the specific issues of what's trying to be accomplished, the idea of engaging away from the substantive argument after it's already been decided and saying, you know, something will blow up the credit rating of the United States unless you accede to us is just a poor policy, and I think a poor demonstration, and I think a poor example of the American political process.
Are you actually worried that we will default?
I think there's a lot. I think it's very unlikely because in this situation, sensibility normally prevails, but it's not an on-off switch. We're already making people insecure. The markets are already responding, and some of the adverse consequences are already being felt, and it will continue to reverberate even after, even if there's an acquiescence. So it's already bad. If we actually went into a position of default, which again would happen a long time from now, but if we actually got there, of course that would be very, very negative. But we're already getting some negative aspects at the moment.
Jim, how do you look at it? You're a company that's always needs credit. You're a huge company. When you look at all this, does it make you nervous?
It makes me nervous. I mean, we're the most capital-intensive industry in the United States, and the Fed's recent move is good for our stock, of course, and our access to capital. But here's the reality. We have a new normal in the United States in terms of unemployment and underemployed. I think it's more in the 6% plus. We have a new normal in terms of growth of GDP. It's 2 to 2.5. It's not what we've experienced in past decades. But I have great hope that over the next 5 to 10 years, we will move out of what today is the new normal and find our way back, because we have an incredible capability in this country to innovate, to create, and we will find a fast track forward. And the growth of our country will accelerate back to what we were comfortable with in the 80s and the 90s.
Denis, when you look at it from the outside of the United States, I mean, in terms of where you grew up, and do you look at this and think that the American political system is crazy, or what?
Do you think I'm going to say that in this room? No, I think you have standoff politics. We saw that in Northern Ireland for 30 years until President Clinton and Tony Blair brought people together. And there just doesn't seem anything like that that's going to happen in the short term in the US. I think in the context of emerging markets, I think one thing that they could do pretty quickly is appoint a new chair of the Fed. I think that is one obstacle out of the way. But I think it all boils down to is the cost of funding. Everybody in the US wants cheaper money and lower interest rates. The Fed wants that. The politicians want it. And that has a big knockoff and spin-off effect on financing emerging market businesses. So, there is instability. But in Europe, we've had 5 years of instability where, some of our policies have been going in one direction, then going in another direction. And certainly our monetary policies have been a little bit confused as well. So I don't think we can be critical. We just love to see, a little bit of more certainty.
Lloyd, when you look at the U.S. political system, it seems deadlocked, paralyzed, use whatever phrase one wants. But the American economy seems to be coming back in a pretty broad way.
Well, the American, because it's pretty resilient. And listen, the American economy, you're right, it's doing well, and there's a lot of tailwinds, energy, you could tick through the amount of tailwinds that are happening. But I think ultimately it's the culture of the United States to deal, Denis was talking about Europe, we all had the same noise, the same stirring and drawing, the same, dealing with the consequences of the credit bubble. But in the United States, we recapitalized the bank. It was painful. People didn't like the way it was done. Nobody liked, and by the way, and the aftermath was also hard. But it got done, restructured, accepted a higher unemployment rate. In other words, didn't make people keep the same employment. Didn't, as often happens in Europe, when you have that different balance between social interests and economic interests. Did all that painful stuff, and now it's as noisy as can be. In other jurisdictions, you had all the noise, you had all the confrontation, but you didn't actually get anything done. And all that remains forward. So the United States is in a position where, again, banks are recapitalized, companies are efficient, not because they protected employment, sadly, because they accepted higher rates of unemployment. That's a social decision that gets made. It's not unreasonable to make a different one, but that's what gets made in the United States. But now that those companies are stronger, they're in a position to grow, to hire people back, run their businesses on a sustainable basis, very liquid, a lot of cash, and I think well positioned for the recovery. And by the way, what growth we have now, it's not that QE represents the first step to normalization. We're all tense and nervous whether the economy can absorb it. We've already taken a substantial number of steps towards normalization. The biggest subsidy the economy had was the fact that we were spending so much money than we were taking in taxes. We've closed up a substantial amount of that budget gap. Sequestration, payroll taxes, higher taxes on others. One step towards normalization was for the 10-year interest rate to go from 1.5% to almost 3%. Those are all steps towards normalization. The removal of the tapering off of QE will be another step, but it's not the first step.
So you don't fear it. You're not one of these people who says once the Fed starts withdrawing these extraordinary measures, the whole system is going to collapse.
It joins a long parade of things over which I'm anxious, and that's an element. But the point is, it is not the first step, and can the economy, whatever growth we're seeing now, is already in the face of the headwinds of a convergence of our spending and our revenue, maybe not to the same place that some people would want it, but maybe 2/3 there.
Right, we're 2/3 of the way to Simpson Bowles' target.
And so everything, all the growth we see this year is in the face of that. In other words, we've already absorbed some of the consequences of normalization. The tapering of QE is not the first step.
Jim, what you were talking about the new normal with unemployment, with the new normal of a kind of leaner, meaner, or at least leaner productive capacity. But the flip side of the new normal, it seems to me, is that businesses are sitting on a lot of cash and they are not investing. And this has been one of these great debates that has gone on for 5 years, which is why are businesses not investing? On the one hand, to put it simply, people say, well, it's the evil Obama administration which hates business, and if only they would be more pro-business, businesses would invest. There's another side which says, look, at the end of the day, you don't have enough demand. Businesses are looking to see, are there opportunities to invest? Where does it stand, and why is it that despite a remarkably robust corporate recovery and recovering corporate profits and cash, businesses are not spending?
I think there are several reasons. I mean, first is there are not the opportunities today to make the investments. And the prudent thing to do in uncertain times without clear opportunities is to hold on to the cash. In time, you'll return it to the shareholders or you'll invest it. And many companies I'm aware of are buying their stock back, they are increasing their dividends, and that's the way they're addressing the situation. But let me get back to the political arena. In this country, we've been blessed to have moderates in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and for business, having our government in the middle of the road, a government that can compromise and both parties can work together, has really given us certainty and confidence in the future. A counterintuitive thing to think about what's happening today is the Republicans go far right, few moderates in the Republican Party anymore. The Democrats are moving to the left, few moderates in the Democratic Party, and actually that creates almost permanent gridlock. So in an interesting way, that's a new normal, but actually a certain certainty because we know there will be gridlock. So all of a sudden, the new way forward is gridlock because the far left and far right don't know how to work together, and they show no desire to work together. And if you think about it as a business person, you go, well, that's not bad because there's going to be a counterbalance, and we're going to have a different certainty, but certainty with respect to what the government can do to business.
But let me ask you, and Lloyd, let me ask you this. Is it fair to make this, kind of moral equivalence, if you will? Yes, both parties are moving in partisan directions, but only one party is threatening to blow up the United States' credit rating.
Yeah, that's right at the moment. And look, you can find fault again in the substance of it. You could say also part of the problem was, this is not we don't have a parliamentary system. We have a system, and Jim alluded to this, where the moderates of both parties are supposed to unite together and have a moderate solution, which, by the way, may or may not be the right result. But it certainly brings about the most stable result. Right. Because then when the party in power shifts, the next party had already signed on to it, made its contribution, owns it. For one moment in time in my life, we had a parliamentary system, in effect, where you had both houses had a veto-proof majority, and the president was of one party, so it was effectively a parliamentary system. And it passed legislation without having to compromise, and consequently, it didn't. And that created a very unstable situation. So the reaction to that, I think, is a terrible reaction. You could go back to a first cause and say, if some of these elements and some of the legislation that had gone on,
if Obamacare had been passed with more Republican support,
and the concessions, maybe some modest concessions that would have had to make to earn that support, it would have been a much better, a much more stable outcome. Again, some people, does democracy produce the best results? In a way, it produces the most stable results, and the most stable tends to be the best results. So now we have a situation where we have Obamacare, and the Republicans want to destroy it, and the Democrats want to, and eventually you're going to have a change of government. It's not a good situation. So I could see the world through the lens of either side. Right now, my focus is really on what the Republicans are doing, which I think is which I don't consider to be the best constructive civic behavior. Because if they don't like the resolution, but it is resolved, to go about and say, I'm going to blow up the budget, or I'm going to blow up the credit, I'm not going to pay for debts that I'd already taken on, I don't think that's right. If you go a step back and you see the underlying cause for their frustration, that wasn't right either.
Denis, again, when you think about this all in the context of Europe's problems, I want to just get your sense of Europe. Lloyd Blankfein said, the one thing about the United States is when we faced the crisis, we dealt with it. We recapitalized the banks. Some of the banks didn't like it at the time, but whatever was done was done. Yeah. In Europe, some of these problems have dragged on. Do you think that as a result, Europe is hampered in its recovery?
Yeah, I think Europe is, we were just talking earlier, I think Europe's about 2 years behind the United States in terms of recovery. The biggest mistake we made was not to adopt what the US did, and that was tarping all our banks. So, we've muddled through this financial crisis. there's been an awful lot of compromises, and you know, Europe is full of compromises. The US is, obviously there's no compromise. So maybe we've gone to the other extreme too much. So, you know, I would still have a concern that we're facing another, we could have another jolt into the banking system. Certainly Greece is heading for a third restructuring. There's just no shock absorber in the system. And I think the benefits in the US of the TARP was there was a shock absorber. But
you're aware of how unpopular TARP was, but you actually think that that's what saved us.
That saved the day. I mean, look, I'm looking in at the United States, and I say, wow, this is okay. It's, you know, people say it's not fast enough, or there's not enough growth, there's not enough new jobs being created, but it still is a fantastic recovery in any context, in economic history terms even. So in Europe, we've kind of muddled through. We're seeing some signs of recovery. But it's just too slow, and I think what will help now that Angela Merkel has been, you know, re-elected, that is going to help because she is the, you know, the big bear leader in Europe as such. But we need to, I think, be more cohesive, and we need to be straighter in terms of what our policies are in Europe.
One piece of the American recovery, Jim, has been the energy story. Tell us from your perspective, how big is that story? You know, of shale, of natural gas, of tight oil, all these things. You know, I think everyone was expecting a technological revolution in energy, and they all expected it would be wind and solar. And there was a technological revolution in energy, but it was in the extraction of hydrocarbons. Correct?
That's correct. And actually, shale gas is probably the most transformative innovation that's occurred in this country in over a decade. Because what it really did, it fundamentally changed the supply of natural gas. We have a 100-year supply. The price is now about $3.50 an MMBTU. And for the first time in the history of our industry, we're dispatching combined cycle gas plants before coal plants. And as a consequence, there's being more coal exported from the United States as we replace coal by burning gas. So we have an inventory problem with coal. But this natural gas has changed how you think about not just the operation of the system. It's done two important things. It's been a great, it's been, as Lloyd said, a tailwind to the economy, but also in terms of achieving our environmental goals. We're in the 1993, 92, 93 level of CO2 emissions in this country, and yet we have significantly more people and a much larger economy. So I think that it's been transformative both in driving our economy, but transformative in meeting our environmental objectives, at least as far as climate change is concerned.
Explain that for a minute. The basic reason is because we have substituted natural gas instead of coal, and natural gas is much cleaner than coal.
That's correct. It has about 50% of the carbon footprint of coal. So that has been a huge advantage for our entire country for this to happen. With respect to tight oil, we have 50% more oil being produced in the United States than we did in 2005. And that has really changed our dependency on foreign oil. That's given us a capability to export more refined products. And so we're in a very great and interesting position. I don't believe energy independence, although every president since Nixon has talked about it. I don't believe that's a goal that we should have as a country.
Why?
Because we need to think of it in terms of trying to export more BTUs than we import. Because we've always exported refined products. We'll be exporting natural gas. There is 19 plus applications pending to build facilities to export natural gas. At the same time, we're exporting coal. And in fact, one of the biggest consumers of the coal we're exporting is Germany. And that's a long story too in terms of how they've kind of gone wrong with their whole policy of transforming the energy infrastructure there. But the important thing for our country is we need to be in a position that we're kind of in balance where we're importing and exporting BTUs, but net, we're an exporter. And that, to me, we're on that road today. And that's so different than we have been in a very long time.
Lloyd, let me ask you a kind of a geoeconomic or geopolitical question related to this. if the United States is barely importing any oil from the Middle East, does that matter?
I mean, huge. It matters hugely. When you think of, again, you never know. You asked this question about did we think we would be, maybe energy independent, but energy sufficient may be a better term because we'll be roughly in balance, and not just the U.S., North America. Who could have contemplated that, and who grew up in the era that we grew up could have imagined that? We always knew that we would be importing oil, dependent on oil, from the most difficult places in the world, probably becoming the most difficult places precisely because they had oil in the first place, the curse of oil. And yet we're in a position now where we can be energy sufficient. What are the ramifications for that? And I think the president alluded to that glancingly in his remark when he kept saying we're going to stay involved in the Middle East. Why is he saying that? Because there's a good chance we don't have to be as involved in the Middle East, because our allies may be a lot more dependent on Middle Eastern oil energy than we are. And what are the ramifications for the kind of commitment that we make? Right now, the United States, through its military, is paying to protect the sea lanes so that Middle Eastern oil can be shipped to China. Somebody else we may decide that burden is too much for us or not material or relevant to us down the road. And so different decisions would have been made over the last 40 years if we were in this situation over the last 40 years. So what does that suggest to the next time? I don't think the ramifications of this have drifted into the mindset or the planning, and the consequences aren't really that well understood yet. And I think it'll take some time. I don't even think the ramifications, the economic forget the geopolitical. I think when I travel and I talk to CEOs all around the world, I would tell you, in Germany, they're much more aware of the competitive aspects of our energy situation vis-a-vis the cost of their energy. They're much more conscious of the burdens on their competitive situation as we are on the advantages of our competitive situation. And I think that's a mistake that we're making, because I think sentiment in the United States matters. Again, economics, markets are economics plus sentiment in a lot of ways, and I don't think it's really translated into the conscience of America just how blessed we are.
So we should be more bullish.
I think we should be more bullish, but I think we should do a better job of reveling in our blessings and not just our burdens.
I like that idea.
Denis, the other big issue that people always talk about when looking at the global economy and competitiveness is technology, something you know very well.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think is going on there. And, at this point, is it still fair to say that the technological revolutions of the future still seem to favor the United States?
I think quite definitely, yes. When you see the larger, really big companies that are coming out of the US, a lot of the innovations coming out of the US, particularly the West Coast. Obviously, China, has a number of major technology companies, Huawei and some of the others. I think the big issue in Europe, of course, really is the fact that our telecoms industry is really in a very fragile position, because the cost of loading up for these spectrum for LTE licenses has severely depleted the balance sheets of many of the telcos in Europe. And they're having a lot of problems because obviously the shareholders want dividends, the government want more investment in broadband. So broadband is a key ingredient in terms of technical innovation. We're also, waiting for a lot of mergers in the telecoms industry, because if you look in the technology sector, there's been many companies coming together. So I think things are at a crossroads at the moment.
Okay, let's talk about the emerging markets. The big story on that front was the question of whether China would have a hard landing and whether that slowdown would have seismic repercussions. What is your take? Is China headed for 6 or 7% growth, and does that have huge consequences? It would seem like it would if that were the case.
Well, it's consequential which way China goes. Listen, whether China has 9% growth or 5% growth, that 4% applied to the economy of China is much more consequential than whether or not the U.S. has 3.5% growth or 2.5% growth, much more consequential. And, not entirely sure. And, we're talking about the long term here. I think that China has just come off a period where it was growth at all costs. If growth at all costs is what's important, guess what? You keep those machines on. You don't care whether they're polluting the environment. You don't care in the long term if you're improving the life of your citizens because you're not making goods for them to consume, but only things for them to export. And that's not sustainable in the long run. And over the past 2 or 3 years, really incredibly quickly, they've restructured a good part of their economy to make it more consumer-oriented. And I think they have a long way to go to make it so that it's more sustainable from an environmental place. Look, as soon as you get a little rich, things like breathing become a little bit more important compared to earning. Once you get beyond having to earn a subsistence economic living, there's certain other things that become important to you and that move forward in the priorities. So I think this is all natural, well and good, and sustainable. And so I think a sustainable 7% growth is not only preferred to a careening 10% growth. It's inevitable that it get that way because you'd never sustain 10% at that place. The country would blow up and the economy would blow up.
One piece of China's growth, Jim, was of course an insatiable need for energy. They were famously building 2 coal-fired power plants a week with all that meant in terms of pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. Do you get the sense, I know you travel to China a lot, do you get a sense that they recognize the environmental cost of this, that they are trying to do something serious? How would you describe the way the Chinese are viewing this from that energy prism?
I'd first start out by saying that the Chinese had a tough mission. They lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and are building a middle class. And one of the things they had to do to make that happen is provide electricity, because access to electricity is catalytic in terms of its impact on economic development. They got that. And so they did whatever they could, and the lowest cost approach to building this energy infrastructure, primarily electricity, was using coal. They did it. But think of where they are today, because they are turning the corner and focusing on environmental issues. They lead the world in solar panel production. They lead the world in wind turbine production. They lead the world in the building of nuclear facilities. They have over 25 facilities that they're building. And in the United States, 70% of our carbon-free electricity comes from nuclear. So they get that, and they are building, and they're actually innovating because they're already thinking about and developing a second and third generation of nuclear facilities for the 21st century. So I think that the Chinese understand the difficulties. I mean, think about the United States when we were in our growth in the 1890s and 1910 and 20. You could go to a lot of major cities in this country and you couldn't see your hand in front of you. And then we brought electrification to those communities, and then there was that transformation. We've reduced the emissions from the coal plants in the U.S., and we've cleaned up the environment every step of the way over the last 100 years. The Chinese are turned their attention to it, and they're going to enforce, and that's actually, this is the issue, is having the state government enforce and require the provincial governments to keep those SO2 scrubbers on and not turn them off to get more output. And I think they will solve their environmental problem. They understand the implications for their people. The people are already expressing their concern and feelings. So I think that you will see China turn on this issue, and I think they will ultimately be a leader, as they are today, on solar and wind and nuclear in terms of low carbon production of electricity.
One of the big transformations that's been taking place in the world, in the developing world, in the emerging markets, is the cell phone revolution. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's some crazy number of people, 3-4 billion people have cell phones, 2 or 3 billion more than have personal computers. Mm-hmm. And so in a sense, the phone has become the personal computer because it is now, you can use it to transmit data. Mm. Do you think that that process is going to produce some kind of leapfrog effect for these countries? Do you see that?
Oh, quite definitely. In Africa, is going by leaps and bounds. And the next, obviously, move is really to bring broadband to these customers. So people using voice and text will, has become normal now across Africa. So broadband is obviously going to be very expensive because a lot of these countries are landlocked, so you don't have submarine cables going onto the information highway. I think the big concern for operators, though, is the fact that we're building these very expensive networks and then other people piggybacking on them, like, for example, Google. Google are sitting on top, up at the top, making a vast amount of money, and then the operators are struggling with their EBITDA margins and generating free cash flow to do the next build out of the network. So I was at the UN Broadband Commission over the weekend, and everybody is very animated about this, that Facebook, Google, Yahoo, all these guys are not paying any tolls on the road to the consumer.
How would that change? Can you imagine? But they could be charged. People just don't want to.
Well, I think the industry should all come together and do their own search engine. That's one step. But I think more and more, operators, and I know in the US they tried to do this, but it didn't work. But I think in emerging markets, definitely, I think the operators will begin to do data plans now, which will have a fee, basically, for getting onto the internet.
When you look, Lloyd, at the emerging markets, do you feel as though we're off those highs where everyone was growing, but even during the crisis? China, India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, many of those economies are in trouble. India, Brazil, the commodities boom has come off, and so some places that used to export a lot. How would you characterize the world of emerging markets?
Yeah, I would say they have problems. I wouldn't say they're in trouble. There's a slight difference in the way I think of that. I think it's inevitable. There's no straight line here. We're kind of ahead of schedule on we thought the emerging markets or the BRICS would be. We were talking before as we were walking in, and I said, if the 20th century was the American century, it may have been our century, but we didn't own every year in it. We had a number of financial crises that we surmounted, but it was a very good 100 years. Every year wasn't so good. I think that this is going to be. I think it's inexorable. I think Jim alluded to the hundreds of millions of people in China, previously burdens on the economic system, now making a contribution, rising into the middle class or near the middle class, consuming more products that other people have to make and earn money from delivering those products. I think that's one way. That I don't think that reverses. They're going to be fits and starts. They're going to be making the wrong thing. You're going to have in China all these power plants that Jim alluded to, and all the roads that are being built, and all the cities that are being built. Guess what? Some of them are going to have been built in the wrong place because they're doing so much so quickly, and they're going to be funded, and guess what? In 1 year, they're going to have to. They're not going to fund them, and they're going to have to be written off, and that'll be a bad year. And the more growth you have, and the faster the growth is, faster growth. But there are going to be more mistakes, and those mistakes will have to be rewritten, and there'll be fits and starts to the whole thing. It is no shock to me that with the jolt in the U.S., not a surprise, but the jolt that the U.S. may be cutting down on the liquidity in the world, and the U.S. is a big liquidity provider to the world, that the ramifications of that will be felt in the U.S., but on a leveraged basis in those countries that have grown more because of the liquidity. They'll have more problems when that liquidity is withdrawn until that adjustment is made again. But to me, this is just part of a normal process, and it won't back off. I think for ourselves, when we talk about the emerging markets, we talk about, and our investment, we talk about scaling our investments so that we don't have to back off from them, because we don't want to be overly seduced or intoxicated at the growth when people are talking about how steep that growth is, and we don't want to get scared to death when that growth gets upset and other people are shrieking, "My God, what was I thinking in the first place?" It's going to grow faster than than the developed world in this century, but not evenly.
When you look at it, Jim, do you think that one of the things I'm struck by is when you go through these setbacks, it forces governments to reform because there's more pressure on them at this point. Do you get the sense that that process is actually at work now when you look at around the world? I mean, is Brazil going through a period of reflection and reform? Is India?
I think it's inevitable. I mean, it's really Lloyd's point. I mean, their growth is not going to be linear, and it's going to be fits and starts, but it's going to be there. But governments have to adjust. I mean, Brazil is going through a very interesting adjustment now, and we see it because of all our power plants in Latin America, the majority are in Brazil. And we see how they're starting to change the system there because they're trying to react, mainly because the leadership there has made certain commitments about the price of electricity going forward. And so they're trying to address that. And I think that's to be expected. I mean, that happens in the United States when we hit kind of a rough spot in the road. You know, our leadership, political leadership looks inward. Corporate leadership starts to take stock. And so I think this is a natural and process. What I would worry more about is if these countries went full speed ahead as if no problem when they hit a bump in the road. Because I think they will be better as a consequence of dealing with it than kind of keeping their foot on the accelerator.
Dennis, you've looked at a couple of these countries that are really emerging, like Myanmar and places like that. And one of the things you feel is that it shows you the futility of sanctions in these places. Talk about that.
Quite definitely. I mean, in the case of Myanmar, I think US policy for many years was sanction, 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 followed by the Europeans. And then Secretary of State Clinton really made a great overture, and they jumped at the opportunity. And now in the space of 18 months, 2 years, Myanmar, that train, the reform train, has left the station, and it is going at a speed that nobody ever expected. 50 years ago, Myanmar was one of the wealthiest countries in Asia. And it is, I would be very bullish about the potential for Myanmar. You don't see a lot of US investors there. You don't see a lot of European investors because for some reason they look at all the problems of a country like Myanmar, whereas Asian investors or South American investors will say, hey, this is some opportunity that we're staring in the face of. And I think it's the way we train business people in Europe in our business schools. They will do all the analysis of all the problems and the risk and the downside without looking at the opportunity. So the lens from Europe and the US needs to be a little bit different to grab that opportunity in a country like Myanmar.
One of the things that I think we have to talk about is the politics of all this. And it's not just in the emerging markets. Again, I mean, this is now a kind of anniversary of the Occupy movement. There's inequality and protests around inequality in many of these countries, from Brazil to Turkey.
To America.
Right. So let me ask you, looking back, with Occupy Wall Street, having its anniversary, what do you think it all means? The Goldman Sachs was not incidental to this whole issue.
I must have missed it. I didn't even realize this was such a big anniversary. I must send flowers. Look, I think there's in the world today, and partly as a result of rapid change in technology, there's a bit of a winner-take-all aspect in some of these aspects. If somebody makes a good product, they want the great product. There's no doubt that the flat world has had some adverse consequences in addition to the great consequences. All these open markets are making that, the manufacturing of every TV in the world is going to take place in Taiwan, and it's not going to take place here. And countries have to compete and win. And if a country comes in second, they may not get anything in a certain kind of product line. That's making for winners who win a lot, and a lot of people who aren't able to keep up competitively. And it's a very bad situation. And it's not just made better by income redistribution, because people don't want to just be sustained. Kids getting out of school need jobs. In order to have jobs, they have to be surrounded by people they have to be in a context in which things are made that other people want to buy. And that's not true in every place around the world, and it became less true in the United States over the last generation. So income redistribution is part of a fix of part of a problem. But the real thing in the United States and in other countries who want to be successful is you have to be competitive, and you have to make things that people want, and you have to make them at a rate where you can price them so that you beat out other competitors.
It's also another anniversary. this is now the 5th anniversary of the financial crisis, and as part of this, your predecessor at Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, made a movie. There was a movie made about him, I should say, about how he
That's
handled
another
the crisis.
surprise that Hank Paulson would be making a movie.
But in that movie, he says, toward the end of it, he says that he was shocked and dismayed, I can't remember the exact word, about the bonuses that banks paid to themselves, to their top management, right after the crisis, after having received this large inflow of funds from the government and other kinds of assistance and things like that. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Well, I'm not sure he said to top management, because in those years, 2008, and top management didn't pay itself any bonuses. But we did pay out.
Depends on what I mean, hundreds of managing directors, I guess.
Right, top people within the company, right. But specifically the people at the top declined to for that very reason. Look, we had, Hank at that time had, his set of objectives that he had to accomplish. We all had to manage our way through the crisis. One thing that I had to do also, and other managers, most senior managers, chief executive officers in my position, is I had to keep my firm together also. In other words, one of the reasons why we were able to navigate the crisis such as we did, it wasn't all, as everyone knows, it wasn't all terrific in every respect. But one of the ways in which we got through it was our people and our firm, which all we do is have people together, was stable during this period, and everybody was focused and got on their front feet and did their job, and we kept that together. And so, notwithstanding, in our case, that we were the firm that may have been under more pressure at that time than anyone else, we were the firm whose overall leadership and whose population was probably the most stable. And if we hadn't paid the people who were doing the work, I don't know if we would have pleased everybody in the country anyway, but one thing for sure, we wouldn't have had the stable population of the firm, because a few people may have done things wrong, but 99% of the people in the firm just came in and were doing their job every day, and they understood why the rest of the country was aggrieved, but they didn't feel that they were the instrumentality of the problem, and they may not have stayed in their jobs. So we certainly didn't pay people well during that period, but even though we performed well, we paid them more than some people thought was appropriate, much less than they would have gotten paid for the equivalent performance in a different time. Had we not done that, I think our company and the industry would have been much less stable. The senior people who could afford to absorb it, they declined to take bonuses those years.
But you understand the feelings in the country, which was they looked at it and said, these guys get these infusion of cash, the Federal Reserve is loaning them cheap money, and they're taking.
I understand it, and that's how I'm responding to. I understand it completely, and we all have dual constituencies, dual audience, trying to accomplish several objectives and weigh them against each other in a different position. Were I only looking at that, I might come up in the same place. But I was also leading a big firm that needed to, not just for the sake of the firm, but also for the financial system, needed to function and needed to look. At the end of the day, I work at the company. I don't own it. I'm not entitled to blow it up or hurt it too severely. And again, the company plays an important role in the system. And certainly, if it performed badly, the country would know the consequences of it performing badly. So we managed to balance those in the best way we can. We paid much less than we would have done at any other time for similar performance, but we didn't pay zero. Had we paid zero, we would have been a much less stable place than we were.
Jim, the flip side of this income inequality that is affecting every country in the emerged world and the emerging world is this issue of what people can do to add value and have good jobs. Now, in the energy industry, actually, there are paths, but the rest of the economy isn't like that. So what do you say to average worker in Europe, in the United States, that has been used to having pretty high wages, and that feels the pressure from the other 300, 400 million skilled workers around the world? What kind of job prospects are there for the American worker, for the European worker?
I think first, for both American and European workers, they're really competing with workers around the world. And while the income inequality is significant in the US and in Europe, the greater income inequality is in the developing world. And at the heart of that problem is the 1.3 billion people who have no access to electricity. So electricity is the enabler of the economy and growth, and it starts to lift people up. I mean, China is a wonderful example, coincidence, 1.3 billion people, where they made a fundamental transformation, but it was driven by bringing access to electricity. The challenge, the bigger challenge, if you step back and think of the entire world, is how to deal with the inequality in the emerging countries, and even comparing the poor in Africa to the poor in the United States, there's a huge gap there. So I think the focus, the best bang for the buck, is really investing in bringing electricity and starting to lift up the poverty, those in poverty in Africa, some remote areas in Latin America and India. To me, addressing that issue is a key to getting the economies going in those countries, which will in turn help the economy of the world.
Denis, how do you look at the issue of income inequality? Because even Ireland, I know that there's been a huge discussion about it because you've had a lot of growth, but you've had a huge expansion of income inequality.
Well, I think, certainly Ireland has had to take some really heavy doses of cod liver oil. It's been, very, very tough for 3 or 4 years. And we've seen real wages drop by, in many cases, about 20%. So, we had just as a country got ahead of ourselves. And now we're kind of an emerging economy again, along with Spain probably, and even Portugal. Just coming back to what Lloyd was talking about there, and you mentioned, obviously the Occupy Wall Street, I would be on the left of that, because I think we should be listening to some of the things that these people are saying, and I would actually have a sneaking regard for some of the things they say. And if you look at CGI, it's a perfect antidote to that, because major corporates, whether they're in the US or Europe or all around the world, multinationals need to do more in their communities. And, for example, Goldman Sachs has done fantastic community initiatives here in the US. But more and more we need to move away from this ticking a box as a CSR statement in our annual reports to actually doing something impactful. And I think, particularly in Africa, particularly in all of the emerging markets, companies that go and invest in those countries really have to do something meaningful to actually change that country. And I think what this is all about is really doing that. People standing up and saying, making a promise to do something, and more of those kind of things. That activity will, I think, be the antidote to the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Did you learn anything from the Occupy Wall Street movement?
Well, there was a lot going on. There were a lot of lessons being given at the same time. It's hard to separate them out, but of course I did. I'd like to say something and respond. Given that we're here and we represent business interests at the Clinton Global Initiative, and say something. And I appreciate Denis's comments, and we do spend, and I think you know this with various programs that we have, we do a lot in the nature of philanthropy at the company level, and a lot of our managing directors and employees are very, very engaged in philanthropy. But I think the biggest contribution that we make, and in fact, as I look at my fellow panelists, that they make, is not going to be in the philanthropic thing, although we do that also, but it's in our core businesses. And I think one thing I would like to say to the Occupy Wall Street interests and others is that business has helped lift people out of poverty, and philanthropy should fill in the gaps. But if I had to say which has made the best, whether it's philanthropy or businesses doing what their core activities are, I would take the latter. When I think of the things that we go and finance around the world, the new industries that we help create, companies that we take public that otherwise wouldn't get financing, that create jobs, or the distribution of electricity at a lower rate so that businesses could be sustainable and to places that didn't have power before, or in the case of Denis, to give phone service, communication, access, given that telephone is not just a conversation between two people, but it's the window on the world now, to give access to the world to people who otherwise were in a remote village. I mean, that's the extraordinary contribution to the world. Now, that shouldn't be the end of it, but I think that's the bulk of it. That's the bulk of what business does. And then, as a supplement, fill into places where the profit motive and where the activity, you know, like kind of like the pharmaceutical equivalent of an orphan drug, fill in those places with philanthropy. But I think we should say more about this and better educate the public about how good business in its core activities has done to elevate people out of poverty in the world.
You feel the Obama administration doesn't appreciate this?
No, I think they do. I think generally it doesn't get spoken of generically. I don't have any complaints with the Obama administration. I think the Obama administration itself has reason to feel underappreciated for some of the great things they've done, you know, to be honest, and people will generally feel that way. But I think that while we're engaged in a conversation, I don't want to have a juxtaposition between what we business people do in our businesses on the one hand and good works that we do philanthropically on the other.
Larry Ellison is said to have remarked that if he had to choose between whether the Ford Motor Company or the Ford Foundation did more good for the world, he would take the Ford Motor Company.
Absolutely. Or Carnegie, or the Carnegie Institution. You know, U.S. Steel or Carnegie Institution. Jim,
talk about providing the kind of electricity Lloyd was talking about, because your next big act, you've done 25 years as CEO of this enormous energy company, and your next act is going to be to try to provide electricity to just about 1.3 billion people.
I think that I need a new mission, and I've been providing electricity in the developed world and some in the developing world in Latin America. But I have seen the need, and I've seen the opportunity to really take this 1.3 billion, and as you do with any big problem, you try to divide it up. And about 500 million of those are in remote locations where the state utility companies will not get to them for several decades. And so the ability to bring money and know-how into those areas is really critical. And there's also that opportunity. I know Obama's got his Power Africa project, which is something that needs to be picked up and driven, because I think that is an important legacy he will leave if he's able to make it happen. The reality is nobody has been able to figure it out, to crack the code, to be able to make it happen. So one of the things that motivates me as I think about the next chapter is to say, what can I do in mobilizing financial resources and talent to be able to bring electricity to these people? Because I know fundamentally I've seen it in examples of where we've done projects in remote locations, fundamentally changes their lives.
Right, on that note, thank you very much for a very great time.